Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yudal, Daf 14 of Masechta Beitzah. Daf Yudal, we're gonna see like a few Mishnayos. How many Mishnayos? 1, 2, 3, 4 Mishnayos on today's Daf. Little like nuggets. We're gonna start out talking about grinding up things like spices, salt, things like that. Then we get into shtickle the sugya of borer. Friends, you remember borer from Masechta Shabbos, selecting food from other foods, I guess, or other things. And then we get to giving gifts on Yom Tov. What kind of things can you send over to your friend's house on Yom Tov? Friends, these are the sugyas that we're going to be talking about today. Let's jump in. We're on Daf Yudal Amud Aleph, 4 lines into the page at the new Mishnah. Beshamei Omim say Beshamei Tadlan Nidochen b'maduch shel eitz. So if you want to grind up spices on Yom Tov, so you can use a pestle of wood. So normally you would use a stone pestle, but a mortar and a pestle. You put in whatever spices you want and pound them up. So normally you would use a stone pestle, but it says Beshamei, if you want to grind up spices on Yom Tov, use a wooden pestle. Some kind of a shinui. Do a shtickle differently. Vamelach bepach. And if you want to grind up salt, so then do it in a flask, which is like you wouldn't normally do it in an earthenware flask. Uve'etz hapar, and with like a wooden spoon of sorts. That's like more of a shinui, right? So if you want to grind up spices, do a little bit of a shinui. Use a wooden pestle. If you want to grind up salt, so then you have to use more of a shinui, a flask, or use a earthenware flask, or like a wooden spoon. So Beitzah says no. When it comes to spices, you can just grind up the spices normally. You don't need any kind of shinui at all. You can use a stone pestle. But salt, you need to do a shtickle shinui, do it a little bit differently, and you do that by using a wooden pestle. Okay, and the Gemara is going to explain why the nafkamina between salt as opposed to spices. So everyone seems to be assuming that spices are like a little bit more lenient than salt, right? So even Beitzah says that you don't need to do any kind of shinui when it comes to spices. You at least need to do a little bit of a shinui by salt. And Beishamai, you say that you need to do a little bit of a shinui by spices, so you'd have to do more of a shinui by salt. Now the Gemara says, okay, so everyone seems to agree though that salt needs a shinui. You have to grind up salt in a sort of different kind of way, not your regular kind of way. Right, so even according to Beitzah, who says that when it comes to spices, you could just grind them up normally, salt nonetheless would have to be done with a wooden pestle. How come? My time. Why? Rav Huna Rav Chisdas. We have a machlokas. We have two opinions. One being Rav Huna's, one being Rav Chisdas. Chad Omar kol hakederes kulin tzrichas melech, ve'en kol hakederes kulin tavlin. So one reason is because, well, everything needs salt. I mean, everything needs salt. I don't know much about cooking, but salt is an important piece of cooking. Even just like preparing a salad, salt just like brings out flavor, and everything needs salt. And therefore, it's not, you could have had the foresight on Erev Yom Tov to say, well, I'm going to be cooking tomorrow. I'm going to need salt. I should probably prepare this before Yom Tov. And because you didn't prepare it before Yom Tov, even though you could have. So if you want to prepare it on Yom Tov, you need to do some kind of a shinui. You have to prepare it in sort of not your normal way of preparing the salt, since you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, since it's pretty clear that whatever you're going to be cooking on Yom Tov is going to need salt, as opposed to, right, whereas different kinds of spices, it depends what you're cooking. Some may require, once already you get into the world of spices, which I'm no expert in the world of spices. Pepper is probably my main spice that I use when I use a spice, but there are other kinds of spices that people use. I don't know, cumin, like that's one example. I don't use cumin often at all. But like, things like that, they're more, some dishes call for them, some dishes don't. And therefore, on Erev Yom Tov, it's not like, well, you're going to need cumin tomorrow, you should really prepare it. Lav davka. And because it's not a no-brainer before Yom Tov that you're going to be needing these other spices, so therefore you can grind them up normally on Yom Tov according to Beis Hillel, and according to Beis Shammai you would do kind of a smaller kind of shinoi, you would use a wooden pestle. The other opinion is the other way of understanding it is that, well, all the other spices, if you would grind them, the longer they wait out, the less potent their flavor becomes. And therefore you want to grind them up as close to cooking time as possible. So therefore we're not going to make you, we're not going to expect that you're going to grind them up before Yom Tov. Salt, on the other hand, you could grind up and it'll be just as salty. And therefore, you could do it before Yom Tov. And if you want to do it on Yom Tov, you have to use at least some kind of a shinoi. My benai, what's the nafkamina between these two opinions? So, ike benai du yadamai kedera bayi levashule. Well, one nafkamina is, let's say you already knew in advance what you wanted to be cooking. So according to the first way of understanding, the reason why you don't need to prepare the spices in advance is because, well, you don't necessarily know what you're cooking tomorrow, and therefore you don't know that you're going to need spices. But if you already knew what you're going to be cooking in advance, and you know that you're going to need the spices, well then, you should have to grind them up in advance. But according to the opinion that says that it's about preserving the flavor of the spices, well then, even if you know in advance, that's not going to change the fact that if you prepare them too early, their flavor is going to weaken. Inam bin Morika, or a different nafkamina between the two views, is if you use saffron. Saffron is something that you can prepare in advance and the flavor stays strong. So in that case, according to the second opinion, well, you could just prepare the saffron in advance, so then maybe you would have to use a shinoi on Yom Tov, whereas according to the first opinion, you still don't necessarily know that you're going to be cooking it the next day, cooking a dish that requires saffron, so therefore you didn't have to prepare in advance. So different nafkaminas between those different ways of understanding salt versus other spices. Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel, kol nidochin kedarken vafilu melach. Says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that you can just grind all sorts of things in the regular way, including salt. Even salt can be ground in a regular way. Va'amart melach boya shinui. But didn't we just say that everyone agrees that salt requires at least some kind of a shinui? Hudamar ki aitano. So Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel says like the following Tana. Okay. The Tanya, as we learn in the Beitzah, Amar Reb Meir says, Reb Meir lo nechleku Beis V'Sila ala nidochen shenidochen kedarkan umelach imoed. So it says this Tana that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that anything that can be ground in a normal way. The melach imoed, and salt with them. Okay, so according to this Tana, both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that all sorts of spices could be just ground up in their normal spicy way. And if you want to include salt with them, Givaldik, you can include salt with them. Lo nechleku ela laducha b'fnei atzma. The machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is with regard to salt. If you want to grind up salt on its own, Beis Shammai omim melach bepach ve'etza par. That Beis Shammai says that you grind up salt in an earthenware flask and with a wooden spoon. Litzali, and also that is only for roasted dishes, because roasted dishes require less salt. Avalolik there, but not for these like cooked dishes which require more salt. Beis Hillel says, b'chol davar, you're allowed to grind up salt with anything. B'chol davar sakadaitich. What do you mean you can grind up salt with anything? What if it's muksa? Can you use something that's muksa in order to grind up salt? Mistamenat. No, you can grind up salt for anything. So whether it's for roasted dishes, whether for cooked dishes, whether, and you can grind it up in any kind of way, even with like a regular stone pestle. So we see that according to this Tana, according to Beis Hillel, you could grind up salt even in just like a regular kind of way. Even just like a regular kind of way. So, there you go. So Rav Acha said to his son, Ki dayacht atzle atzluye v'doch. Okay. So Rav Acha said to his son, if you're going to be, grinding up things, so then you should at least take the mortar and put it on its side, make some kind of a shinui. Rav Sheshes shama kol buchna. Rav Sheshes heard on Yom Tiv the sound of a mortar and a pestle. Omra haylav migabe de beisoihu. He said, okay, well, this is definitely not coming from my house, because in my house we don't grind these things. But maybe, how do you know it's not coming from your house? Maybe it is coming from your house, but they're doing it with the shinoi, right? They're like leaning it, and therefore it's okay. The Shamidav Kale, well, Rav Sheshes heard that the sound was very stark, was very strong and clear, and if you would be pounding and grinding the spices on its side, it wouldn't be that clear. Vidoma Tavlin Havu, but then we say, but maybe they're just grinding up regular spices, not salt. And therefore, if it's regular spices, what's the big deal? What's the problem? Spices would have a very loud sound, and this wasn't a particularly loud sound. So you knew that it was salt. Also, if Sheshes, for what it's worth, if Sheshes was blind. So I don't know if that maybe his hearing was particularly sensitive, and he knew exactly from hearing what was going on, that it was salt that was being ground without a shinoi, and therefore he knew that it was not coming from his house, because he had banned such practices, such activities in his household. Tanu Rabbanon D'Abisoy Osin Tiske Vein Kochim B'Machteshes. Okay, says the Beitzah that we don't make tisnei. When you make tisnei, you take like wheat and you like crush the kernels into 4 parts. It's like 4 little piecey things. Vein Kochim B'Machteshes, and we don't grind things in a mortar. Tarte, why do we need to say, like, what's the deal with these two things? They don't seem to be, the first we say, like, we don't make tisnei, which is this thing that you have to, like, divide into 4 things, but it implies that maybe, like, other kinds of spices and stuff, other kinds of grinding that's, like, not as advanced, that's not as fine, so that would be okay. But then it says, Vein kochim b'machteshes, that we don't grind anything in a mortar. So what's the dealio? So this is what it means. Matam in osin tisnei. How come we don't make tisnei? Lefisha in kochim b'machteshes, because we don't grind anything in a grinder. So then memela we don't make tisnei. Velema in kochim b'machteshes. If that's the case, then just say we don't grind up anything in a grinder, in a mortar. Inami, if that's the case, in kochim b'machteshes. Itani in kochim b'machteshes. If it would say that we don't grind in a mortar, havamina ani meli b'machteshes gedola. I would think that that's a big mortar. Don't grind in a big grinder mortar thing. Kamash Milan, therefore it's saying that it's not just a big mortar that you're not allowed to use, but you're actually not allowed to use any kind of a mortar. Alright, sounds fun. But we learn in the Beitzah, but 1 second, we have a Beitzah that says, well, you're not allowed to use a large grinder, you can use a smaller one. Tanya. So Abaye basically amends our answer to say that actually in the first one, when it says not to use a grinder, it means don't use a large one, but you can use a smaller one, like we see in the later Beitzah that you actually are allowed to use a smaller grinder. Okay, fine. Rava Omar Lukash Alam Balu says, Rava, it depends. It depends if it's in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz. The internet just went out. Every day in Eretz Yisrael, the internet goes out every day. It's, I've mentioned in the past that the internet in Eretz Yisrael is not the greatest. So every day it dies at some point. So it died just now. This is a convenient time for it to die because I'm not really using the internet right now. I'm just recording. So the mice actually, it's very nice that it died right now, because hopefully then it won't die later when I'm in like a meeting or something. Al Koponim. So says Rave that Halan valu, it depends. In Bavel, where we don't have corrupt servants, so then you can use a small pestle, like a small mortar, because you're allowed to use a small mortar. And we're not concerned that the servants are going to use like big mortars that aren't allowed to be used, but claim that they use small ones. But in Eretz Yisrael, where the servants are liable to use a larger mortar and pestle, but say that they used a smaller one, so then we can't really trust them. So that's why we have that other brayso that says that you can't use any mortar and pestle, not big, not small. All right. Rav Papi ikla levei Mar Shmuel. Rav Papi went to Mar Shmuel's house. Aisu lei daisa v'lo achol, and they brought out for him daisa, like farina kind of stuff, I think, and he didn't consume it. Vidil machteshes ketana avdua. So fek the Gemara, wait, why didn't he eat it? Maybe they made it taka in a small grinder. Well, he saw that it was very, very fine. Because it was very fine, it must have been done in a bigger grinder. Maybe they taka prepared it before Yom Tov. He saw that it was very, very white, which means that it was freshly ground. So those who say that, Shmuel's house is different because the servants over there are corrupt. And therefore, just like Rava had said that in Eretz Yisrael where the servants are untrustworthy, so you can't use any of these grinders, you can't use a small grinder at all, because then the servants might use a larger grinder and claim to have used a smaller grinder. In Bavel, that's not the case, but apparently in Shmuel, I assume that Mar Shmuel is Shmuel. That's interesting. Apparently in Shmuel's house, the servants were corrupt, and you couldn't trust them, and therefore you couldn't have any ground stuff there from a grinder, because they may have been using the big grinder, even though they're not allowed to. All right, sounds fun. All right, friends. Now we get to a new Mishnah. Bor kitni is b'yomtiv. A fellow is selecting beans on Yom Tov. He has beans, and the beans are together with carrots. He wants the beans. He doesn't want the carrots. Let's say. So Beis Shammai bor ochel v'ochel. So says Beis Shammai. So you could select the food. You could select the parts that you want to eat, just like on Shabbos. Beis Hillel omrim bor kedarko. Beis Hillel says you could just select things however you want on Yom Tov. Becheko, in his lap, bekanun v'tamchui, with a funnel or with a plate, avalo b'tavla v'lo b'napa v'lo b'chvara, but not with like a big plate, and not with a like fine sieve or a coarse sieve. Don't use any of those things. But you can, select the food, take what you want, whether you want to separate the food that you don't want, the food that you do want. Beis Hillel is more lenient in that manner. Gamliel says you can even like add water and like let the parts that you don't want float to the top, and then just remove them like that. You could do that too. Tanya Omer Gamliel. When does Beis Hillel say that you're allowed to remove the psolis, the stuff that you don't want? It's only when there's a lot more ochel, when there's more ochel, food that you do want, than psolis, the food that you don't want. So then, in that case, you can just remove the parts that you don't want, according to Beis Hillel. Aval, psolis mubal ochel, but if there's more parts that you don't want than the parts that you do want, so then don't get rid of the majority part. Don't spend all your time getting rid of the psolis that you don't want. Everyone agrees that in that case, you'll take the ochel, you'll take the food that you want, and just leave the psolis. One second. If we're talking about a situation where there's more psolis than there is ochel, well then wouldn't the ochel just be considered batul, and it will be like you have a whole plate of psolis, and therefore it'd be muksa because you don't want it? So lo tzricha denafesh betircha v'zutu b'shur. So the Gemara answer is no, it's not talking about where there's actually more psolis than there is ochel, because in that case, yes, the ochel would be batul, and it would just be muksa. It's talking about where there's more ochel than there is psolis, but it would be a pain in the neck to remove the psolis. So the tircha involved in removing the psolis is more significant than the tircha involved, the exertion involved in removing the ochel. And in that case, even though there's less psolis than there is ochel, but because it's more tircha, so that would not be allowed. All right. But if there's just like a little bit of psolis and it's not such a big deal to remove, Beis Hillel would say, look, you could just remove the parts you don't want, and that's fine. Even though in general on Shabbos you would take the parts that you do want. You would not select out the parts that you don't want. Gamliel says you can even like add water and let the things float to the top. What does that mean? Tanya, we learn in the Beitzah. This is what they would do by the house of Rav Gamliel. They would take a bucket full of lentils, and they would cover it in water. And what would happen is the lentils would stay on the bottom, and whatever impurities, whatever parts that they didn't want would just float to the top of the bucket, and then they would just be able to skim that off of the top. But 1 second, don't we have a Beitzah that Taka says the opposite, that they would add the water and the parts that they and the bad parts would sink to the bottom. Lokasha ba'afra begile, it depends. If we're talking about dirt and dust, that would go to the bottom. If we're talking about straw and stuff, that kind of stuff would float to the top. All right, sounds very nice. And then once it was separated via water, they would just kind of get rid of the parts that they don't want. All right, that sounds like fun. It says the Mishnah, so according to Beis Shammai, what can you send to your friend on Yom Tov? What kind of gift? A piece of chicken, something they can eat, maybe a salad or something, right? So like a portion. Whereas Beitzah says Mishalchin behema, you can send their whole animal. Chayev, of undomesticated animals, birds, bein chayim, and shchutin, alive, slaughtered, whatever it is, you could send these things to your friend. Mishalchin yeno shmanim v'slatos, you could send wines, oils, flours, kidneys, legumes. Avalotvu, but not wheat, like stalks of wheat. Don't send that on Yom Tov. Reb Shimon matir b'tvu. Reb Shimon says you can even send stalks of wheat. Like that's no problem. Tani Reb Yechiel, says the Gemara, that Reb Yechiel says you can send these gifts, but don't send it in like a long line. If you have like a whole bunch of people going to schlep things over between Reuven and Shimon's house, then already people might get the wrong idea and think that like you're going out to the market or something. We don't want that. Tane and Shura pchusim mishlosha b'nei adam. A Shura, this line that we don't want you to go out in, so that's at least 3 people. Ravashi asks, well, what if you have 3 people in the line and each person just has like one thing that they're going to take? In that case, meaning we said that one person can take something to his friend. So what if you have 3 people and each person only has one thing? Like, should that just be considered like okay? Because you just have a few people taking, like, each person's taking one thing. Says the Gemara, take it, we don't know. Reb Shimon matir b'tvua. Reb Shimon allows you to bring over wheat to your friend's house. Tanya, we learn in the Beitzah, Reb Shimon matir b'tvua. Reb Shimon allows people to bring like stalks of wheat to their friend. Kigon chitin lasos mein ludius, such as wheat to make some kind of a wheat dish. Sorim litin lifnei behemto, barley to give his animal, adoshim lasos mein resisin, and legumes, lentils, in order to make some kind of a lentil dish. In these cases, you'd be able to use the wheat or the barley or the lentils on Yom Tov. So therefore, you could bring them over. Says the new Mishnah, the final Mishnah for the day, Mishalchin kelim ben tfurin ben she'enin tfurin. Says the Mishnah that you could send on Yom Tov to your friend clothing, whether the clothing is sewn, whether the clothing is not sewn. And even if there's kilaim, even if there's shatnez, which is an interesting point, so the Gemara is going to ask about that. And you need them for the festival. Avol lo sandal amasumr, but not the sandal amasumr, not these spiky sandals, which we learned about in Masechta Shabbos, because there was that story, that incident with the Romans or something, and people were hiding out, and they saw the sandal, and they thought somebody had left, and that their hiding space was exposed, and they ended up killing each other. But it was a whole mess. So we don't take those out on Yom Tov. V'lo minol sheino tafur, and not a shoe that is not sewn. Reb Yehuda Omer aflo minol lavan. Says Reb Yehuda, also don't send to your friend a white shoe because you're going to need a craftsman. You can't use them yet because they would only wear black shoes. So if you have a white shoe, you need a craftsman to paint it black. So, since you're not going to be able to do that on Yom Tov, so don't send white shoes. Also, the general rule is that if you can get benefit from it on Yom Tov, so you can send it as a gift. Says the Gemara, So I understand clothing that is already sewn, that's ready-made clothing. You can wear it. I understand why you can give clothing to your friend that he could wear. Or even if the clothing isn't sewn, but still you could wrap yourself in it, cover yourself in it. But why are you allowed to send shatnez to your friend? What can you do with shatnez? If you could say, well, you could fold it up and then sit on it. We learn in the Beitzah, when the pasuk says, don't put any shatnez on, but you would be allowed to put it underneath you. But the rabbi said, don't put it under you. Lest a situation arise where a thread from the shatnez gets wrapped around your flesh. And therefore, to prevent such a situation of that happening, and that you end up unwittingly wearing shatnez, so we say, don't just have nothing to do with it. Don't even fold it and put it and sit on it. And if you're going to say, well, maybe it's talking about that, well, you could take the shatnez garment and then fold it up and then put something between you and the garment, and maybe that's okay. But Amr B'Shimon ben Pazi, Amr B'Shua ben Levi, Amr B'Yosef ben Shalom, Amr Rebbe Mishum Kol HaKadisha de B'Yushalayim Afil Esu Matzah Zo Al Gabe Zo U'Kloim Tachteim, that even if you have 10 cloths, one on top of the other, and underneath all 10 cloths, all the way at the bottom, is shatnez, also lishan aleim, you're still not allowed to sleep on them. Right? So basically, we don't want you to have anything to do with shatnez. If that's the case, why are you allowed to send shatnez to your friend on Yom Tif? What can you possibly do with it? So ella bevilon. So the Gemara wants to suggest that we're talking about a curtain, meaning a cloth that you would put up as a curtain to divide between rooms. But one second, didn't Ula say, how come they said that a curtain can become tummy? Because generally the walls of a house would not become tummy. Right? I guess even if you have tumas ha'oel, so that doesn't make the house tummy. It just means everything in it becomes tummy, and you take out the mace and the house is no longer tummy. Right? The house isn't tummy. But if you have like a curtain between rooms, that curtain is able to become tummy. We don't treat it as a wall. How come? Because the servant might, warm himself up by this curtain, and therefore he uses it, and therefore it can become tummy. So what do we see? So if a servant kind of uses it to warm himself up, well, then it should be shaykh to the halacha of shatnez, elabakashin. So we're talking about a garment that's very rough, very hard. And because it's rough and hard and stiff, so you can't really warm yourself up with it, and because you can't, get warmth from it, so it's not something that's shaykh to shatnez. Okay? It's like Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua said, Hay namta gamda denarish sharia, that this namta gamda, which is I guess some kind of a stiff garment from narish, is not going to be an issue of kilayim, of shatnez. Rav Papa says, Rav Papa, ardolin in boy mishum kilayim. Says Rav Papa that ardolin. What was the ardolin? Some kind of a thing that they would put under their shoes, and it was linen, I guess, and it would maybe then there was also wool there or something, but it's not really an issue of kilayim, I guess. Amar Rava says, Rava hanitzare devshite in boy mishum kilayim. Some sack that you what's it called? Not like a sack, but something a pouch that you would have for stones, I think, and stuff, or no, for coins. Some coin patch. And by mishum kilayim, there's no issue of shatnez because you're not going to get warmed up by a coin pouch. The bazrone yesh mishum kilayim, but a pouch that you use for seeds and stuff. So then there is an issue of kilayim because I guess you could warm yourself up with it. Whereas Rav Ashi says, look, whether it's a coin pouch or whether it's a seeds pouch, there's no issue of shatnez because you're not really going to warm yourself up with a seeds pouch or whatever. So, all right, there you go. So no kilayim there, friends. That was daf Yud Dalet of Masechta Beitzah. All right, so the first part of Yud Dalet talked about grinding things up. And we saw a nafkamina between, or at least, the first way to understand the machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, which is that we saw a nafkamina between spices and salt. That, at least according to the Mishnah, everyone agrees that salt requires some kind of a shinoi to grind it up in a different way. Whereas spices, according to Beitzah, you don't need to do any kind of shinoi at all. According to Beis Shammai, you have to do some shinoi. And the question was, what's the difference between spices and salt? So we saw Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. We don't know who says what, but there's machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. One way to understand it is because, well, every cooked dish needs salt. So it's easy to have the foresight before Yom Tov to say, well, I'm going to need salt tomorrow, so you should have prepared it in advance. That's why it's more stringent. Whereas spices, not necessarily everything needs different kinds of spices, so you can grind them up on Yom Tov without a shinoi, at least according to Beis Hillel. According to Beis Shammai, you'd have to have a small shinoi. The other way of understanding it is that regular spices, their flavor will sort of weaken over time, so therefore you can grind them up just right before you cook them, whereas salt you really could have done in advance since the flavor isn't really going anywhere. And then we saw another Beitzah where Beis Hillel says that actually also when it comes to salt, you don't need to do any kind of shinoi either. Okay, fine. Then we got to a Mishnah where we talked about borer. We saw that according to Beis Hillel, you would be allowed to select the psolas from the ochel. You could remove the parts that you don't want out of the ochel. Even though on Shabbos in general, you would select the parts that you do want and eat it. On Yom Tov, you could even remove the parts that you don't want. And we clarified there that that's specifically talking about when there's more ochel than there is psolas. Because if there's more psolas than ochel, then the ochel would be batul, and it would just be like you have a bunch of psolas and it would be muk, so you wouldn't be able to move it at all. So it's talking about when there's more ochel from psolas, but the psolas would be, so there's more ochel than there is psolas. And as long as the psolas isn't too much effort to remove, so then you can remove it. But if it would be too much effort to remove the psolas, then even Beis Hillel would say, don't remove the psolas from the ochel. And then we said that you're allowed to send, according to Beis Hillel, all sorts of gifts, animals, live, slaughtered, things like that, just not wheat. And then Reb Shimon says you can even send wheat. And then we got to a final Mishnah where we said that you can send all sorts of clothing, whether they're sewed, whether they're not sewed, even kilayim. We said, why can you send kilayim? We said, well, as long as it's stiff, and you can't actually, if it's stiff, then you don't get like warmth and benefit from it, and it's not an issue of kilayim, so you could send that. All right, enjoy your stiff kilayim clothing on Yom Tov. Friends, that was Daf Yudalev Masechta Beitzah. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.